Great. Thank you so much, David. We're a visual privacy company, but my team asked me that you take pictures for us, even though my consent wasn't involved here. Thank you for being here. I'm stepping in for our CTO, Vojta, who was supposed to be here. So for those of you who were expecting to hear our CTO talk, you won't be disappointed. I'm the better speaker. But just to highlight how this begins, 24 years ago, Andy Grove, the legendary former CEO of Intel, spoke about what would become one of the biggest concerns of our time, and that's privacy. And he talked about how at the heart of the internet, there's going to be a force that's going to want to collect data about you and 200 million others, and how people will be tempted to do trade and commerce with that asset. Fast forward, none of you, all of you have probably seen the news. There's unprecedented scale of data collection that's happening. And before we move on, can I just get a quick show of hands to see how many of you actually care about personal data? Great. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up for a second. How many of you filled out the data subject rights form from Meta, which prevents them from using your data to train AI? Keep your hands down if you've already filled it out. Great. So now you all have homework. You don't need the session anymore. But why does it matter? And this is why we're going to go through this session and talk about the risks involved and why it matters if personal data is used for training AI. Regurgitation, I think, Florian, you've already covered it, so you've saved me some time. Essentially, out-of-context revelation of personal data, which is when training data leaks. Surveillance, one of the biggest examples being what's happening in China with the Uyghur community, which is a Muslim minority. They have been targeted by facial recognition systems where law enforcement is using it to trace and track them. And while we may think examples like this are happening in other far-off parts of the world, for those of you who've been following the EU AI bill, there's been last-minute changes to the act, which allowed for loopholes, where now you can have facial recognition technology being deployed on pre-existing data, so not on live cameras, which opens up a whole new set of security issues. And also, the act makes no mention of facial recognition technology bans on immigrants. And what does surveillance lead to? One of the things is discrimination, where I'm not sure if many of you would be familiar with this, but in 2019, HireVue, one of the biggest HR tech platforms that does automated video interviews, launched a facial analysis feature which generates an employability score. They discontinued it 3 years later, but we have now huge platforms like Eightfold, which are essentially these behemoth talent intelligence platforms that the moment you apply to a company with your CV, they take that and then they recognize who you are, and then they parse the internet to collect everything, all the data that is publicly available about you, and build an applicant profile and then score you for a certain job, while also predicting what is the probability of success that you would have in the new role. Now you can imagine the challenges that come around this. Misinformation, I think you'd all be familiar with, of course, deepfakes that have been coming up. Taylor Swift, need I mention? But it's a global issue. And this sort of propagates a big issue around the sexism that exists in many cultures around the world, where women have been the targets of deepfake pornography. But while you may think that misinformation or deepfakes is only used for reputation loss, these are also used to augment reputation, which is what we've been saying, where Trump supporters have been using deepfakes to augment his profile among black voters, which have traditionally voted for Biden. And when you put surveillance and targeted misinformation together, you get manipulation. And in my opinion, this is probably the most dangerous of all of these. If you think about how your mind is programmed today, it is the result of all the information that you've been gathering throughout the years, that you've been ingesting and then accumulating in your mind. And the moment someone is able to control the information that is put in front of you, that ultimately formulates your thoughts and ultimately your actions, that means we can start manipulating you. So the impact range is not just individual, where people have fallen victims to financial scams, but also business, where a finance worker in Hong Kong actually had paid out 25 million when after he was on a group call with his deepfake colleagues. But I think what's going to be even more dangerous is the next wave. Right now, you have generative AI, which allows you to create content that can manipulate, but AI agents essentially will be the dominant platform in the coming years. And in the next 5 years, you're going to have these large big tech companies release these products, which allow you to work across applications and platforms. So think about how you open your laptop today, open a certain application, and go about doing certain tasks, which you have to run by your own. But essentially, the next user interface will be when you open your laptop and you're interacting with a powerful AI assistant that does all the work for you. Now, if there's malicious intent that is behind, if there's control over these AI assistants and platforms, then you can imagine to what extent they can distort your reality. So how do we bridge this gap? Preventing training isn't an option. Putting bags over our heads and walking around in public isn't an option. So how do we bridge this gap between utility and privacy? The current standard, which has been used for the last few decades, has been blurring, redaction, pixelation. They're great at protecting identity, they're compliant, but they have a limited use in AI training because there's no valuable attributes preserved. Of course, there's synthetic data sets that are coming up thanks to generative AI. Promising uses, there's no real identities involved, but of course, they themselves require training on personal data. And ultimately, what you use, when you use synthetic data sets, it reduces the quality of your training that you have. Ethical data sets are a fantastic alternative. They're fully consent-driven, legally compliant, and when you deploy it rightly, content creators are compensated for the work. But of course, as you imagine, it's difficult and expensive, and there's a certain time limit on how long you can store that data, which is why you see a lot of companies are not using it today. And then you have new and upcoming solutions like what we've been developing at Egonim, which is essentially fighting fire with fire. So you're taking an original identity, you're preserving the attributes, but scraping and, not scraping, but obscuring the identity and replacing it with a synthetically generated random identity. So this ensures you can use it for diverse applications such as AI/ML training, because it allows you to preserve the attributes but scrub away the data. So hopefully at this point you've understood why it matters that we have newer solutions around personal data protection. And I think over the last decades, we've already seen the harms that just individual platforms have had on our individual health and on society at large, where we've let these algorithms run rampant without regulation. And hopefully we don't have these issues going forward as newer regulations that are coming up have acknowledged the risks that these platforms and these new solutions possess. And although some may argue that these regulations will prevent Europe from innovating and competing in the big tech race, arms race that's going on, and I think to some extent that is true in the short term, but what we need is for this to be used as a framework of trust from which we can launch new solutions forward and regain the trust of society in general when it comes to digital technologies. So thank you very much for listening. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but we'll leave that up to you.
Thank you.